This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Among the many tough lessons learned by companies and nations during the pandemic, there was this. The global economy can be a pretty fragile thing. The war in Ukraine and a trade war between the U.S. and China have only deepened this precarity. Carlos Kuriyama was formerly the advisor to Peru's Ministry of Foreign Trade and Tourism. It's a country that struggled to absorb energy and agricultural shocks from the past few years. He now leads the research and analysis arm of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Group. It's a yearly trade meeting where delegates from Pacific nations get together to hash out business and environmental challenges. There are few places in the world where delegates from the United States, China, and Russia, among other nations, meet together to consider trade and economic issues. This year, the United States plays host to the meeting, which involves more than 1,500 delegates from 21 economies. And for transparency, World Affairs partnered with APEC to bring you a perspective from officials like Kuriyama during a conference in Palm Springs in early March. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Good afternoon, Ray. Thanks for having me.
APEC is such an interesting group because of the history of the last 150 years of war and peace and decolonization. It's hard to imagine a more diverse international body. Former British dominions like Australia and New Zealand, still officially Marxist states like Vietnam and China, monarchies like Thailand and Brunei, and hybrid systems like Malaysia's, and crucially, some of the world's richest and poorest states. Will the APEC members be able to bounce back from the dire economic effects of the pandemic?
It's been some rough years since the pandemic, but we are looking at some upside opportunities. I think the reopening of borders and the removal of restrictions, related to COVID-19 are giving us a window of opportunity. So in that sense, I think it's possible to spark some economic growth. And with that, we will also improve, the conditions for people. So we can see some recent numbers in terms of jobs, and we can see that fortunately the numbers in terms of people employed is relatively healthy. I think we are starting to see good numbers on that. On the other hand, we are starting to taper down inflation thanks to some aggressive policies by governments. Inflation is a tax against the poor. They are the ones who feel it the most. And fortunately, we've been able to prevent a situation in which this is going to spiral out of control.
One of the things that countries started to say during the pandemic is, well, maybe free trade isn't the best answer, and we've got to worry that we have enough for our own people. So we're not going to sell our exports in other countries. We're going to make sure that we supply ourselves first. There was this sort of growing drumbeat, you might say, of protectionism, of reinstating borders and reinstating limits on trade. Is that ending, or is that sentiment continuing now? What did you hear during the conference?
I would say, when the situation is difficult, there are always concerns about protectionism. You will always hear from certain groups about the need to protect the economy, the market, to keep the production at home, things like those. However, I think governments have been showing some interesting signals in a way that they are committing to keep trade open, in a way that they are, for example, committed not to implement new export restrictions or prohibitions to essential goods. So can you imagine in this situation of the pandemic if all countries in the world, had implemented export prohibitions or restrictions to basic goods like food or medicines? The situation would be very chaotic, would have been very chaotic. But fortunately, because governments refrained from implementing some of these extreme measures, it was possible, for many governments to obtain necessary supplies of food, vaccines, and medical supplies, among other essential stuff.
A new report from the World Bank has identified serious losses in social capital as a result of the pandemic, and particularly finds lost time in school, the erosion of learning that happens when children are out of the classroom for a long time. They've identified lower literacy and numeracy, less well-prepared young workers entering the workforce, pretty dire impacts. Is there any way to make up for the lost time of the pandemic? Are you worried about not just getting back to business in 2023, but the effects we may still feel 5 years from now, 10 years from now?
Yes, I'm worried, and I can illustrate this with a personal example. I live in Singapore. My son studies in a school in Singapore, and during the pandemic, he only lost 1 month of going to school. But his cousins in Peru, they lost 2 years. They were 2 years out of school. So they were only receiving education online. But online education may work probably for older kids. But for kids in primary school or in early years, it's very, very hard. I mean, kindergarten, elementary school is a very critical time of life where, I mean, the kids are in a stage of exploration. They are absorbing all this basic knowledge that are going to help them for the rest of their lives. And that's the precise opportunity that they have to retain all this knowledge. This is a very important stage of their intellectual development. And I think, I mean, governments are learning from all these experiences. And I think one of the conclusions that they are coming up with is that it's important to keep schools open. We cannot make, again, the same mistake. I think it's possible to run schools and keep social distancing during the most critical times. And Singapore is a good example how that was done. Also, other things that could have been done was to, for example, increase the medical testing and support vaccinations. And that's very critical to reduce the chances for students and teachers to get sick. So it's not an easy task how to help students to catch up, but this will require a lot of effort from families, parents, also from schools, providing some, for example, additional tutoring, mentoring in school, catching up with maybe additional hours of lessons. But I'm concerned about this generation that many of them have lost 2 years of schooling on site.
Are you worried that the countries that can least afford those kind of losses, the ones that were already spending too little per pupil, for instance, on primary education, are the ones that are also least able to put more resources into helping students catch up?
Yeah, I mean, all these problems are increasing the gap between wealthy families and the middle class and poorest families. During the pandemic, we can see that wealthy families have access to high-speed internet, to laptops. They could hire a tutor for their kids, but not all middle-class families can do that. And the poorest families, they cannot afford a computer. They cannot have access probably to internet, and getting a tutor will be very, very difficult. So I can give you some examples on how problematic this has been. And I know well the case of Peru, where I'm from. In the 2 years of pandemic, it's estimated that because of the closure of schools, around more than 100,000 students interrupted their studies. And this is just because of the lack of digital connectivity, or because of economic problems. Their parents were not getting enough income and they had to go out and find a job. Also, in Peru, there were some problems that around 20% of the private schools closed because of bankruptcy. And many of those students that couldn't go to those schools anymore or attend lessons online anymore moved to the public schools, and the public schools are already poorly equipped. So it's adding more pressure to the public education system.
Russia is a member of APEC, and even with the tense state of relations between the host country, the United States, and Russia, Russia was invited to the conference. And even though APEC insists it's avowedly economic rather than security oriented, was there any realistic way to keep Ukraine out of the conversation that you've been having in California?
What I could say is that it will be worse if the governments are not talking. It's important to keep talking, and that gives us hope that things could be resolved. I mean, we know APEC is not a fora where political issues are discussed. We basically discuss economic issues. But the fact that we are keeping some communications here, that could help to resolve problems, in the corresponding fora where political, issues are discussed.
Well, let me get back to economics then. When I was in Peru, I visited the port of Callao, and it was the worst period of the 2008-2009 recession in the United States. And I was talking to the port manager, and he was telling me that it was more busy than ever, and there were ships being loaded left and right on every dock. And I said, well, where are all those ships going? And the one answer was China. Now, China did a lot of business with the Pacific nations of South America in those years, and it has sometimes, like the United States, been looked to as a country that helps pull the rest of the world out of tough economic times. But the economy is softening in China. Can China be relied upon to be the engine that pulls other countries out of these tough times once again?
Well, I think the recovery of the Chinese economy is going to help the whole world. But I think the port manager in Peru probably didn't give you the right answer, because the containers, yes, many of them were going to China, but many others were going to the United States, to Europe, to the rest of Latin America, and to many other countries in Asia. And why? The reason was that Peru decided to go for a policy of economic openness and sign trade agreements. And in that way, we could enlarge our domestic market and also be able to sell to the rest of the world. And actually, the social indicators say that strategy was right, in a way that the levels of poverty went down from 50% to 20% in around 10, 15 years. So it was very significant, the reduction of poverty, because what it happened is that the economy became more vibrant, more dynamic, and there were a lot of positive spillovers. And it was also for us to be able to get cheaper technology, and that made companies more efficient. So it was overall, I think, a very positive outcome, and that's why Peru, despite these difficult times, is still pushing for economic openness.
Is that an example of how an organization like APEC works for a country like Peru?
Yeah, for example, it's because of APEC that Peru was able to sign many of these trade agreements and also investment protection agreements with governments in Asia. So that gave us the exposure. We got to know, we showed them that we could be serious on that. And little by little, we started expanding the network. So first, Peru started with a trade agreement with Thailand. And then came Singapore. So they are important economies, but they are not the largest economies. But after others noticed that we had signed deals with Thailand and Singapore, started to get interested in Peru. And we were able to first get an agreement with China. Then, after we got it with China, Korea was also willing to have one with us. And then Japan was knocking the door to Peru and saying, we also want to be there. And we got an agreement with Japan as well. There have been other arrangements, agreements later on, but I have to say that Peruvian products can now access many of the markets in Asia with a preferential treatment.
Are you going to be able to make up for lost time, pandemic time, Or is that something that's really what economists call a long tail problem? Is the recovery from this longer than people realize?
We have to move forward. So we are doing two things in a way that we are implementing measures to rescue and recover the economy, but at the same time, we have to move forward, move ahead, and adapt to the new times. So we are noticing some of the main challenges in not just in the region, but in the world are about climate change. So we are looking at, for example, how we can change the energy mix in a way that we could have more renewables, how we could sequester greenhouse gases, how we can promote the use of goods that will help us to reduce or eliminate greenhouse gas emissions, how we could increase the forest cover all over the world. In recent times, we have had a lot of natural disasters. And on average in the region, those natural disasters could cost us more than $100 billion, just to recover. And most of these have been exacerbated by these problems about climate. So it's time to take action.
Carlos Kuriyama is the new head of the Policy Support Unit. That's the Policy Research and Analysis arm of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Group. He joined us from the APEC conference. Carlos Kuriyama, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ray. Nice meeting you.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Matteo Schimpf, and Andrew Stelzer. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.